It was a day like any other, or so I thought. I came home a bit earlier than usual, expecting the familiar smell of dinner cooking and the sound of Julia humming to herself in the kitchen. But as I stepped through the front door, I was met with an unusual silence. The house felt empty, almost too quiet. I tossed my keys on the counter and noticed Julia's phone lying on the kitchen table. The screen lit up, vibrating with a new message. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but something made me pause. The message preview caught my eye. Meet me at the cafe in 30 minutes. I miss you. My heart skipped a beat. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was a wrong number, a misunderstanding. But a nagging feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was picking up her phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I wasn't the type to snoop. Trust had always been the foundation of our marriage. Or at least that's what I thought. But this message, it felt wrong, too intimate. I tapped to unlock the phone, my hands trembling slightly as I navigated to her messages. There were more. A conversation spanning weeks, if not months. The words on the screen blurred as I scrolled through them, each line cutting deeper than the last. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. Miss you already. And then his name, James. I knew him. Everyone in our town knew him. James, the charismatic musician who played at the local bar on weekends, always drawing a crowd with his guitar and easy smile. I had never thought much of him, just another face in the crowd. But now, seeing his name on my wife's phone, everything clicked into place. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in going out more often, the way she'd been distant lately. It all made sense. Julia wasn't working late, she was with him. A wave of nausea washed over me as I put the phone down. My mind racing. Confronting her immediately was my first thought, but something held me back. I didn't want to lash out in anger, not yet. I needed to know more, how long this had been going on, how deep their relationship ran. I needed proof, not just for me, but for everyone who knew us, who believed in us. An idea began to form, cold and calculated. I wouldn't just confront her. I would expose her, and I would do it in a way she'd never forget. But first, I needed to gather evidence. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. Every moment spent with Julia felt like a lie, a betrayal that cut deeper each time she smiled at me, each time she pretended everything was normal. I couldn't confront her, not yet. The plan I had in mind required patience and precision. I began to notice all the little things I'd been blind to before. The way she'd glance at her phone with a slight smile when she thought I wasn't looking, the sudden increase in work meetings that dragged on late into the evening. And the way she'd become more guarded, keeping her phone closer, her emotions more distant. It wasn't just paranoia. The signs were all there, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. I needed to be certain, to have undeniable proof. That's when I decided to bring in someone who could help me get the evidence I needed, someone who would see through the lies and expose the truth. I contacted a private investigator, a man named Robert Turner. He came highly recommended by a friend, someone who had gone through a messy divorce and had nothing but praise for Robert's discretion and effectiveness. We met in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place where I was sure no one would recognize me. Robert was a no-nonsense type of guy, middle-aged with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, he only wanted the facts. "What exactly do you need from me, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I need you to find out everything you can about my wife's affair," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Who she's with, where they go, how long it's been going on. I need solid evidence, photos, videos, whatever you can get." He nodded, taking notes. "Understood. How much time do I have?" "Not long," I replied. "I'm planning something special. I need everything you can gather within the next few weeks. There's a dinner I'm hosting on our anniversary, and I want to reveal everything then." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "I'll get started right away. You'll receive regular updates, but I'll be discreet. No one will know I'm there." We agreed on the terms, and I handed him an envelope with the initial payment. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for what I was about to do, for how I was going to expose Julia in front of everyone. But relief, too, knowing that soon, I would have the truth in my hands, that this nightmare would finally come to an end. Over the next few days, Robert's updates came in sporadically, each one more damning than the last. Photographs of Julia and James together at that same cafe, walking hand in hand down quiet streets, disappearing into hotels. There were videos, too, grainy footage of them kissing, laughing, completely unaware that they were being watched. Each piece of evidence felt like a stab to the heart, but it also fueled my resolve. I couldn't turn back now. The more I saw, the more determined I became to go through with my plan. Julia had made a fool out of me, out of our marriage, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. As the anniversary dinner approached, I prepared for the final act. I arranged for the venue, and invited friends and family, making sure everyone would be there to witness what I had in store. Julia, of course, had no idea. She was excited, talking about how wonderful it would be to celebrate another year together, blissfully unaware that this would be the night her lies came crashing down around her. I felt no joy in what I was about to do, only a cold, calculated need for justice. Julia had chosen to betray me, and now she would face the consequences. As the day of the anniversary dinner drew near, the tension in the house was palpable. Julia was buzzing with excitement, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. She spent days planning the menu, selecting her outfit, and making sure everything would be perfect for the celebration. Watching her, I couldn't help but feel a deep, seething anger, an anger that I kept hidden behind a mask of indifference. The evidence Robert had gathered was irrefutable. I had everything I needed: photos, videos, and even transcripts of their text messages. Julia's affair with James was out in the open now, at least to me. It was hard to keep up the charade, to act as if nothing was wrong when inside, I was raging. But I knew I had to stay calm and keep my composure until the right moment. I spent the last few days making sure every detail of the dinner was perfect. I chose a high-end restaurant, the kind of place where everyone in town would notice us, where Julia's humiliation would be complete. I made the reservations under the pretense of wanting to make the night special, and Julia didn't suspect a thing. She thought I was finally coming around, that I was just as eager to celebrate our marriage as she was. On the day of the dinner, I dressed in my best suit, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety twisting in my gut. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but the fear of how it would all unfold still gnawed at me. This wasn't just about exposing Julia. It was about taking back control, about making sure she understood the gravity of her betrayal. We arrived at the restaurant early, and I could tell Julia was impressed. She kept looking around, admiring the decor, and the way the waitstaff treated us like royalty. She was radiant, smiling at everyone, blissfully unaware that this night was about to turn into her worst nightmare. As our guests began to arrive, I greeted them with a forced smile, all the while feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. My parents, Julia's parents, our closest friends, everyone was here, just as I had planned. The room was filled with laughter and chatter, the sound of clinking glasses and celebratory toasts. Julia was in her element, soaking up the attention, completely unaware of the trap I had set for her. Once everyone had settled in and the first course had been served, I knew it was time. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, holding my glass, and signaled for the room's attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady, though inside I was shaking. "Julia and I are so grateful to have you all with us as we celebrate another year of our marriage. It means the world to us." Julia smiled up at me, her eyes shining with affection. It took everything in me not to flinch. "But," I continued, my tone shifting, "there's something I need to share with all of you. Something that I've discovered recently. Something that has changed everything for me." The room fell silent, and I could see the confusion on Julia's face as she looked around, trying to gauge what was happening. I took a deep breath and reached for the small remote I had hidden in my pocket. "I've always believed that the truth has a way of coming to light," I said, pressing the button. The lights dimmed, and a screen descended from the ceiling, capturing everyone's attention. A projector whirred to life, and within moments, the first images appeared on the screen, images of Julia and James together, their affair laid bare for everyone to see. There was a collective gasp from the guests as photo after photo flashed across the screen, each one more damning than the last. Julia's face drained of color, her eyes wide with horror as she realized what was happening. She tried to speak, to say something, but no words came out. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was nothing she could say to defend herself. "Julia," I said, my voice cold and emotionless, "I know about you and James. I've known for a while. And now, everyone else knows too. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the revelation sinking in as everyone looked at Julia with a mix of shock, pity, and disgust. She was trembling now, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at me, silently begging for mercy. But I had none to give. I trusted you, I continued, my voice rising, and this is how you repay me. By lying, by cheating, by making a mockery of our marriage? I've spent the last few weeks gathering this evidence, preparing for this moment, because you deserve to be exposed for what you've done. Julia finally found her voice, but it was weak, barely more than a whisper. Michael, please, I'm sorry. But her words meant nothing to me now. It was too late to apologize. I'm done, I said, my voice final. We're done. I hope it was worth it, Julia. I hope you and James were worth everything you've just lost. With that, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. The sound of her sobs echoed in my ears, but I didn't look back. As I stepped into the cool night air, a sense of calm washed over me. It was over. Julia had been exposed, and now, finally, I could move on. The night air was crisp, almost refreshing as I stepped out of the restaurant. The distant sounds of the city hummed around me, a stark contrast to the tense silence I had left behind. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away from the scene I had just orchestrated. My mind was racing, emotions I had kept bottled up for so long now swirling chaotically. I walked for what felt like hours, the streets becoming quieter as I ventured further from the restaurant. The satisfaction I had expected to feel was there, but it was mingled with a hollow emptiness. The truth was out, and Julia had been exposed, but at what cost? I had torn down everything we had built together, destroyed the life we once shared. Eventually, I found myself at a small park, the kind of place where parents bring their children during the day, but now it was deserted, the playground empty and still. I sat down on a bench, the events of the evening replaying in my mind. I had done what I needed to do, but the weight of it all pressed down on me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting it to be a message from Julia. Some desperate attempt to explain or apologize. But it wasn't her. It was Robert, the detective. I answered, my voice sounding more tired than I expected. Robert. Michael, I just wanted to let you know that everything went according to plan on my end, he said, his tone professional as always. I've already sent you the final report with all the evidence, in case you need it for the divorce proceedings. Divorce. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known this was coming, that there was no other way forward, but hearing it out loud made it feel so much more real. Thanks, Robert, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I appreciate everything you've done. Anytime. And Michael, take care of yourself. I know this isn't easy. I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand. The final report. Everything I needed to put the last nail in the coffin of our marriage. I should have felt relief, maybe even closure, but all I felt was a deep sense of loss. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. The familiar warmth was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that seemed to echo with the silence of the night. Julia's car wasn't in the driveway, and I knew she hadn't come home. I wasn't sure if she would ever return, but that didn't matter anymore. There was no going back. I walked through the rooms, each one a reminder of the life we had once shared. The photos on the walls, the furniture we had picked out together, the little touches that made this place our home, all of it seemed meaningless now. I paused in the living room, my eyes landing on the fireplace mantel where a photo of us on our wedding day still stood. We looked so happy and so in love. I picked it up, staring at the smiling faces in the picture, trying to remember what that felt like. But the memory felt distant, like it belonged to another life, another person. I placed the photo face down on the mantel, unable to bear looking at it any longer. I made my way to the bedroom, the bed that now felt too big, too empty. I sat down on the edge, my head in my hands, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. For months, I had been driven by anger, by the need to expose Julia, to make her pay for what she had done. But now that it was over, now that the truth was out, all I felt was a profound sadness. I had loved her once, with everything I had, and now all that was left was a broken heart and the shattered pieces of a life that would never be the same. The next few days passed in a blur. I filed for divorce, the paperwork a painful reminder of the finality of it all. I moved out of the house, leaving behind the memories that haunted me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just packed a bag and left. I needed time and space to figure out what came next. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a place where I could start over, away from the reminders of what I had lost. It wasn't much, but it was a fresh start, and that's what I needed most. Life didn't return to normal, how could it? But slowly, I began to pick up the pieces. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void that Julia's absence had left. I reconnected with old friends and started going out more, trying to remember what it was like to live for myself and not for a marriage that had turned into a lie. There were moments when the pain was overwhelming, when I questioned if I had done the right thing or if there was some other way it could have ended. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. Julia had made her choice. And I had made mine. One evening, a few weeks after the dinner, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Julia. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I even wanted to know what she had to say. But curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded the paper, her familiar handwriting bringing back a rush of memories. Michael, I don't know where to begin, or if you'll even read this, but I needed to try. I'm so sorry for everything. I know that doesn't change what I've done, but I need you to know how much I regret it. I never wanted to hurt you, and I know I've destroyed everything we had. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope one day you can find it in your heart to understand why it happened. I wish things could have been different. I wish I had been stronger and more honest with you and with myself. You didn't deserve any of this. I'll always remember the good times, and I'll always be sorry for the pain I caused. I hope you find happiness again, even if it's not with me. Julia. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Her words didn't change anything, but there was a small comfort in knowing that she regretted what she had done. It wasn't closure, but it was something. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I began to heal. The anger faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Life moved on, and so did I. There was no going back to what we had, no undoing the past, but there was a future ahead of me, a future that I was ready to face. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: I was free. Months passed, and life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. The routine of work, the quiet solitude of my apartment, and the occasional gatherings with friends became my new normal. I had left behind the old neighborhood, the house that was once filled with memories of Julia and me. The divorce was finalized with little fanfare, just a few signatures and a brief exchange of words in a lawyer's office. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the marriage that had once meant everything to me was now just a piece of paper, void of meaning. I didn't think much about Julia anymore. Her letter was the last real connection between us, and after reading it, I had put it away, along with the emotions it stirred. There was no point in dwelling on the past. I was determined to look forward, to find some semblance of happiness again. One day, I found myself wandering through a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. It was a vibrant area, full of life and energy, far removed from the quiet streets I had grown accustomed to. As I walked, I stumbled upon a small bookstore tucked away between two larger buildings. The sign above the door was old and faded, but something about it drew me in. Inside, the store was cozy, with tall shelves crammed with books of every kind. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air, a comforting scent that reminded me of simpler times. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of books. Not really looking for anything in particular. As I rounded a corner, I nearly bumped into someone. I looked up to apologize and found myself staring into the eyes of a woman about my age. She had short brown hair that framed her face and warm, hazel eyes that sparkled with curiosity. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping back to give her space. She smiled a friendly, easy smile. "No worries. I'm always getting lost in here." I couldn't help but smile back. "It's a good place to get lost." We stood there for a moment, an awkward silence settling between us before she extended her hand. "I'm Rachel, by the way." "Michael," I replied, shaking her hand. "Nice to meet you, Michael. Are you a regular here?" she asked, glancing around the store. "Not really," I admitted. "I just stumbled in today." Rachel nodded, her smile never fading. "It's a great spot. I come here whenever I need to escape the chaos of life for a while." We ended up talking for a while, standing in that little aisle surrounded by books. Rachel told me about her job as a graphic designer, her love for literature, and her penchant for wandering the city in search of inspiration. There was an ease to our conversation that I hadn't felt in a long time, a connection that felt natural and unforced. Before we knew it, an hour had passed. The sunlight streaming through the windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Rachel glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should probably get going," she said reluctantly. "But it was really nice talking to you, Michael." "Yeah, it was," I agreed, feeling a strange reluctance to let the moment end. Rachel hesitated for a second, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad. She scribbled something on a page, tore it out, and handed it to me. "Here's my number," she said with a smile. "Maybe we can grab a coffee sometime? Continue our conversation?" I took the paper, feeling a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'd like that." We said our goodbyes, and as I left the bookstore, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. Rachel was a stranger, someone I had just met, but there was something about her that made me think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for me to find happiness again. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I met up several times, first for coffee, then for dinners and long walks around the city. Each time, the connection between us grew stronger. There was no pretense, no pressure, just two people enjoying each other's company. She didn't pry into my past, and I didn't ask about hers. We were just Michael and Rachel, two people trying to make sense of the world and finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself thinking about Julia again. It wasn't with the same anger or bitterness as before, but with a quiet acceptance. I realized that meeting Rachel had changed something in me. I was beginning to let go of the past, to stop defining myself by the betrayal and the pain. I was starting to see that there was life beyond the hurt and that I could build something new, something better. As I sat in my apartment that night, I took out Julia's letter one last time. I read it slowly, letting her words sink in, but this time, they didn't sting as much. I could see now that we were both flawed, both responsible for the collapse of our marriage. But that was behind me now. I folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Julia was a part of my past, but she didn't have to define my future. That future was still unwritten, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what it would bring. With Rachel by my side, I felt like I was ready to start writing the next chapter of my life. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but I knew now that I could face them. I was stronger than I had been, more resilient. And most importantly, I was no longer alone. Life with Rachel felt like a breath of fresh air. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship deepened, evolving from casual conversations and coffee dates into something more meaningful. We spent our weekends exploring the city, finding hidden gems in the form of quaint cafes, art galleries, and small parks that seemed untouched by time. There was an effortless comfort in our connection, the kind that made the weight of the past feel lighter. Rachel was unlike anyone I had ever known. She had a way of seeing the world that was both practical and optimistic. She understood the complexities of life and the struggles we all face, but she never let them weigh her down. Instead, she approached everything with a quiet resilience that I found inspiring. It was as if she had an unshakable belief that things would work out, no matter how bleak they seemed. One evening, we were sitting on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. It was a warm night, the kind that made everything feel a little more possible. We had just finished dinner, and Rachel was leaning back in her chair, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between us. "About us." I turned to her, curious but not alarmed. "What about us?" She smiled, a little shyly, which was rare for her. "I know we haven't really talked about where this is going, and I don't want to rush anything, but I really like where we are. I like being with you, Michael." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that I hadn't realized I was ready to hold. For so long, I had been focused on surviving, on getting through each day without sinking into the darkness that had once consumed me. But with Rachel, things were different. She didn't just make me forget the pain, she made me want to live again. "I like being with you too, Rachel," I said, my voice steady. More than I ever expected. She reached out and took my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Then let's not overthink it. Let's just take it one day at a time and see where it leads us." It was a simple agreement, but it felt like a promise, one that I was finally ready to make. The idea of a future, of something beyond the pain and betrayal I had known, was no longer just a distant hope. It was becoming a reality. As the weeks passed, Rachel and I grew closer, our lives slowly intertwining in ways that felt natural and right. She met some of my old friends, and I met hers. We started making plans together, small things like weekend trips to the countryside or trying out new restaurants, but each plan felt like a step towards something more permanent. One Saturday morning, Rachel surprised me with an idea. How about we take a trip? Just the two of us. Somewhere we've never been. I looked at her, a little taken aback. A trip? Where? She shrugged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Anywhere. We could drive up the coast, find a little town by the ocean. Or maybe go hiking in the mountains. It doesn't really matter where we go, just that we go together. The thought of getting away, of leaving behind the city and the memories that still lingered in its streets, was incredibly appealing. It felt like a chance to truly start fresh, to build new memories that belonged to us alone. Let's do it, I agreed, feeling a rush of excitement. Let's get out of here for a while. We spent the next week planning our getaway, finally settling on a small seaside town a few hours' drive away. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, with quaint cottages, a lighthouse perched on a cliff, and a long stretch of beach that was perfect for walking at sunset. When the day finally came, we packed our bags, loaded up the car, and hit the road. The drive was peaceful, the conversation easy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't thought possible. The miles rolled by, and with each passing moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift a little more. We arrived in the town just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything. Our cottage was perfect, small, cozy, and just a short walk from the beach. After unpacking, we made our way down to the shore, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filling the air. As we walked along the sand, hand in hand, I realized something. I wasn't thinking about Julia. For so long, her betrayal had been a constant presence in my mind, shaping every decision and every thought. But now, with Rachel by my side, I felt free from that burden. The pain was still there, a scar that would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined who I was. We stopped at the edge of the water, the waves lapping at our feet, and Rachel turned to me, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. "Michael," she said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want you to be a part of it." Her words hung in the air, filled with a vulnerability that matched my own. I had been so afraid of opening my heart again, of trusting someone after everything that had happened, but Rachel had shown me that it was possible to heal, to move forward. "I want that too," I replied, my voice filled with conviction. "I'm ready to see where this takes us, wherever that might be." We stood there for a long time, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. At that moment, I knew that I had finally taken the first real step toward my new life. A life where the past no longer held me back. Where I could embrace the present and look forward to the future. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. The waves whispered against the shore, a soothing reminder that life, like the ocean, is always moving, always changing. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to move with it. The trip to the seaside town felt like a turning point for Rachel and me. We returned to the city with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever came next. Our relationship had grown stronger, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly moving forward. The memories of my life with Julia still lingered, but they no longer held the power they once did. I was learning to live in the present, to focus on the future rather than the past. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up work for the day, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, a strange feeling settling in my gut. When I finally clicked on the message, my heart skipped a beat. "Michael, it's Julia. Can we talk, please?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It had been months since our divorce was finalized, months since I had last heard from her. Her sudden reappearance in my life was the last thing I expected, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to ignore the message, to keep moving forward without looking back. But another part of me, the part that had once loved her deeply, was curious. What could she possibly want after all this time? I didn't respond right away. Instead, I put my phone down and tried to focus on the tasks in front of me, but my mind kept drifting back to the message. By the time I left the office, I had made up my mind. I needed to know what she wanted, even if it was just to finally put everything to rest. I waited until I was home, sitting on the edge of my bed before I typed out a response. "What do you want to talk about?" Her reply came almost immediately. "I just need to see you. Please, Michael, it's important." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Rachel and I had built something real, something good. I didn't want to jeopardize that by getting entangled in my past again. But I also knew that if I didn't hear Julia out, the unanswered questions would gnaw at me. "Okay, where?" She suggested a cafe downtown, a neutral place where we could meet without any of the baggage of our shared history. I agreed, setting a time for the next day. When I arrived at the cafe, Julia was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, older, maybe a little more tired, but still the woman I had once loved. Seeing her again after all this time stirred up emotions I thought I had buried, but I pushed them aside as I approached her. "Michael," she said softly as I sat down across from her. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The last time we had been face to face, it had been in that restaurant when I had exposed her affair to everyone we knew. The memory of that night hung between us like a dark cloud. Julia fiddled with her coffee cup, her eyes avoiding mine. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," she began. "About us. About how it all fell apart." I remained silent, letting her talk. This was her show now, and I was just there to listen. "I know I hurt you, Michael. More than I can ever apologize for. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." Her words were sincere, but I had heard apologies before. I had heard her say she was sorry right before she walked out of our marriage, right before she betrayed me with James. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface for so long threatened to bubble up again, but I kept it in check. "Why now, Julia?" I asked, my voice steady. "Why are you reaching out after all this time?" She sighed, finally looking me in the eye. "Because I've realized how much I lost. Not just you, but everything we had. I've spent these past months trying to rebuild my life, but it's not the same. Nothing is the same." She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Michael. I know that ship has sailed. But I need to tell you that I regret everything. I needed to tell you that I still care about you." There it was. The truth she had been holding back. She still cared about me. The confession hung in the air, heavy with implications. But as I sat there, listening to Julia pour out her heart, I realized something important. I didn't feel the same way anymore. Whatever love I had for her had been eroded by the lies, the betrayal, and the months of pain that followed. What I felt now was something different, pity, perhaps, or a deep sadness for what could have been, but not love. "I appreciate you saying that, Julia," I said carefully. "But we can't go back. Too much has happened, and I've moved on." Her face fell, the hope that had been in her eyes dimming. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, I considered reaching out to comfort her, but I stopped myself. It wasn't my place anymore. "I'm with someone now," I continued, deciding to be honest. "Her name is Rachel, and she's everything I need." Julia nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm happy for you, Michael. I really am. You deserve to be happy." We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of our shared history pressing down on us. There was nothing more to say. No way to mend what was broken. Finally, Julia stood up, signaling that it was time to go. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly. "I wish you all the best." "Take care, Julia," I replied, watching as she walked away, disappearing into the crowd outside the cafe. As I left the cafe, I felt a strange sense of relief. Seeing Julia again had been difficult, but it had also given me the closure I didn't know I needed. I had confronted the ghost of our past and come out the other side. Stronger and more certain of the path I was on. When I got home, Rachel was waiting for me, her face lighting up when she saw me walk through the door. I smiled back, the warmth of her presence washing over me. She didn't ask about the meeting, and I didn't offer any details. There was no need. What mattered was that I was here, in the present, with her. That night, as we lay in bed, I held Rachel a little closer, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance I had been given. The past was finally behind me, and for the first time, I felt truly free to embrace the future. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it, with Rachel by my side. The days following my meeting with Julia were surprisingly calm. I had expected to feel more unsettled and more conflicted, but instead, there was a sense of peace that I hadn't anticipated. Seeing her again had been difficult, but it had also affirmed something I already knew. I was done with that chapter of my life. I had made my peace with the past. And now, I was ready to fully embrace the future. Rachel noticed the change in me almost immediately. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You seem different lately," she said, her voice soft but probing. "More at ease, maybe?" I looked at her, smiling. "I am different. I had a conversation with Julia the other day." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt, waiting for me to continue. "She reached out and said she wanted to talk. I wasn't sure if I should go, but I did. We met at a cafe, and she apologized, and told me she still cared about me." I paused, watching Rachel's reaction. But I realized something while I was sitting there, listening to her. I realized that I don't feel the same way anymore. I've moved on, Rachel. I'm not stuck in that place of hurt and anger. I'm here, with you, and that's where I want to be. Rachel's face softened, and she leaned in closer, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm glad you're finding peace. Michael, you deserve it." Her words were like a balm, soothing the last remnants of unease I had been carrying. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the movie playing in the background, but our thoughts elsewhere. As the weeks passed, life continued its steady, reassuring rhythm. My work was going well, Rachel and I were growing closer, and the wounds from my past were finally healing. But just when I thought the dust had settled, life threw one final curveball my way. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, just as I was leaving the office. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I considered ignoring it, but something made me answer. "Hello? Michael, it's James." The voice on the other end was familiar, though strained. It took me a moment to place it, but when I did, my heart sank. "James? What do you want?" My tone was sharp, all traces of the calm I had been feeling evaporating. There was a pause, and I could hear him take a deep breath before he spoke again. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. It's about Julia." His words sent a jolt of unease through me. Julia. Even after all this time, her name had the power to unsettle me. "What about her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's not doing well," James said quietly. "After everything that happened, after you exposed us, she's been struggling. A lot. I've tried to help, but it's beyond me now. I thought you should know." I wasn't sure how to respond. A part of me wanted to tell him that it wasn't my problem, that Julia had made her bed and now she had to lie in it. But another part of me, the part that had once loved her, felt a pang of concern. "What do you expect me to do about it, James?" I asked, a little more gently this time. "I don't know," he admitted. "But she's falling apart, Michael. I think she needs closure. Maybe if she heard it from you, she could start to move on." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. This was the last thing I wanted to deal with. But deep down, I knew that James might be right. Maybe I owed it to both of us to close this chapter for good. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll talk to her." James gave me an address, a small apartment on the other side of town. It was clear that Julia had moved out of the house we had shared, probably too many memories there for her, just as there were for me. I agreed to meet her the next day, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and resolve. The next day, I found myself standing outside the apartment building, a nondescript structure that looked like it had seen better days. I hesitated before ringing the buzzer, taking a deep breath to steady myself. This was it, the final step in putting the past behind me. Julia answered the door, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. She looked different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes. It was clear that she had been through a lot since the last time we had spoken. "Michael," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, and it struck me how far Julia had fallen from the life we once had together. I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for her, despite everything. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. "James said you wanted to talk," I began, breaking the silence. Julia nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. I just wanted to apologize again, Michael. For everything. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can say it enough." Her voice was shaky, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. I let her speak, knowing that this was something she needed to do. I've lost everything, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. My friends, my family, you. And it's all my fault. I've been trying to pick up the pieces, but I don't know how. I'm so lost, Michael. The rawness of her confession cut through me, but I knew I couldn't let myself get drawn back into her pain. I had come too far and worked too hard to rebuild my life. But maybe, just maybe, I could offer her some of the peace I had found. Julia, I said, my voice steady. I accept your apology, but you need to understand that we're not the same people we were back then. We've both changed, and we need to move on. You need to find a way to forgive yourself and start fresh, just like I have. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. How, Michael? How did you move on? I thought about Rachel, about the life we were building together. I found something worth holding on to, I said simply. And I let go of the rest. Julia nodded, wiping her tears. Thank you, Michael. I don't know if I'll ever be able to move on, but I'll try. I promise I'll try. We sat in silence for a few more moments before I stood up, signaling that it was time for me to go. Take care of yourself, Julia, I said, meaning every word. You deserve to find peace, too. She walked me to the door, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This time, the closure was real. The past was finally where it belonged, behind me. When I got home, Rachel was waiting, just as she always was, and as I walked through the door, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The future was ours, and it was time to embrace it fully. The days after my final meeting with Julia passed in a blur of routine and quiet contentment. Life, it seemed, was finally settling into a steady rhythm, one that I had longed for during the chaos of the past year. With Julia no longer occupying space in my thoughts, I found myself more present in my relationship with Rachel, more engaged in the simple joys of our life together. One Saturday morning, Rachel and I decided to take a drive out of the city. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the kind of warmth that hinted at the coming of summer. We didn't have a specific destination in mind, we just wanted to escape the city for a while, to breathe in the fresh air and enjoy each other's company without any distractions. As we drove along winding country roads, the landscape around us transformed from urban sprawl to rolling hills and lush greenery. Rachel reached over and intertwined her fingers with mine, her touch a comforting reminder of the bond we shared. This is nice, she said, her voice soft and content. Just the two of us, no plans, no obligations. It feels like we're leaving everything behind, even if it's just for a little while. I nodded, glancing over at her with a smile. It does. Sometimes I think we should do this more often, just get away from it all and enjoy the moment. She smiled back, her eyes sparkling with the same happiness that I felt. I agree, we should make it a regular thing. We drove in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional bird call from the surrounding trees. Eventually, we came across a small lake nestled in a valley, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the blue sky above. Let's stop here, Rachel suggested, her eyes lighting up at the sight. It's beautiful. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, and we got out, taking in the serene beauty of the place. There was a small, grassy area by the water's edge, perfect for a picnic. We spread out a blanket and sat down, enjoying the peacefulness of our surroundings. As we ate, we talked about everything and nothing, the kind of easy, flowing conversation that only comes with deep comfort and trust. Rachel told me about a new project she was excited about at work, and I shared some of the ideas I'd been toying with for the future. At one point, Rachel turned to me, her expression suddenly serious. Michael, can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, curious about the shift in her tone. She hesitated for a moment as if gathering her thoughts. Do you ever think about what's next for us? I mean, we've been together for a while now, and things are going so well. I just wonder if you've thought about where we're headed. Her question caught me off guard, but in a good way. It was something I had been thinking about too, especially now that the shadows of my past had finally faded. I admitted, taking her hand in mine. And I think about it a lot. Rachel, I don't want to rush anything. But I also know that I don't want to be without you. You've brought so much joy and stability into my life, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. Her eyes softened, and she squeezed my hand. I feel the same way, Michael. I don't want to rush either, but I think we both know that this is something real, something worth building on. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the unspoken understanding passing between us. It was a moment of clarity, of shared purpose, and it felt like the beginning of something new and beautiful. I want to take the next step with you, I said finally, my voice steady and sure. Whatever that looks like. Whether it's moving in together, or something more. I'm ready when you are. Rachel's smile widened, and she leaned in to kiss me, a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of all the things we didn't need to say out loud. Let's take it one day at a time, she whispered against my lips. But let's make those days count. We spent the rest of the afternoon by the lake, talking about our hopes and dreams. And making plans for the future. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with promise and possibility. The weight of the past was gone, replaced by a sense of lightness and hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, we packed up our things and headed back to the car. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the warmth of the day's events. When we finally arrived back at my apartment, Rachel turned to me with a mischievous smile. So, about those plans. How do you feel about dinner with my parents next weekend? I laughed, nodding. I'd love that. As we walked into the apartment, hand in hand, I realized just how far I had come. The man who had once been consumed by anger and betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to embrace the future with open arms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly happy, happy with where I was, happy with who I was with, and happy with the road that lay ahead. It was a new dawn, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The following week passed in a blur of anticipation and excitement. Rachel and I were making plans, small ones, like dinner with her parents, and bigger ones, like discussing the possibility of moving in together. It felt like our relationship was growing stronger with every conversation and every shared moment. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, life had one more surprise in store for me. It started with a phone call. I was at work, going through some emails when my phone buzzed on my desk. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. Hello? Michael, it's Emily. The voice on the other end of the line sent a chill down my spine. Emily was one of Julia's closest friends, someone I hadn't heard from since the divorce. The suddenness of her call immediately put me on edge. Emily? What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. There was a pause, and I could hear her take a deep breath before she continued. I know it's been a while, and I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. It's about Julia. The mention of Julia's name brought back a flood of emotions, anger, betrayal, pity, but I pushed them aside. What about her? She's in trouble, Michael. Big trouble, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to say this, but she's been spiraling. After everything that happened, she's been drinking a lot and making bad decisions. She got involved with some people who aren't exactly safe. I felt a knot form in my stomach. As much as I wanted to believe that I had moved on, the news about Julia still affected me. I didn't love her anymore, but I didn't want to see her destroyed either. What kind of trouble, Emily? I asked, my voice growing tense. I don't know all the details, but I heard she's been borrowing money from some shady characters, and now they're threatening her. I'm scared for her, Michael. She's not thinking straight, and I don't know what to do. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't my problem anymore. I had cut ties with Julia, and I had no obligation to help her. But the thought of her in danger, of her life falling apart even further, made it hard to ignore. Have you talked to her? Tried to get her some help? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I've tried, but she won't listen to me, Emily admitted. Her voice thick with worry. She's stubborn, you know that. But I thought maybe if she heard from you, it might make a difference. I know it's asking a lot, but she trusts you more than anyone else, even after everything. I sighed, rubbing my temples. This was the last thing I wanted to get involved in, especially now that my life was finally on track. But could I really turn my back on Julia when she was in such a dark place? All right, I said finally, my voice heavy with reluctance. I'll talk to her. But I can't promise anything, Emily. I don't know if she'll listen to me either. Thank you, Michael. I didn't know who else to turn to, she said, relief evident in her voice. She gave me Julia's address, a rundown apartment in a part of town that was far from the life she once knew. I promised to reach out to Julia that evening, and after a few more words, we hung up. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. The thought of seeing Julia again, of getting pulled back into the mess that I had worked so hard to leave behind, filled me with dread. But there was a part of me, a part one couldn't ignore, that felt responsible. After all, I had played a role in her downfall, even if she had brought it upon herself. When I got home that evening, Rachel was waiting for me with a smile, as she always did. But as soon as she saw my face, her smile faded, replaced by concern. "Michael, what's wrong?" she asked, coming over to me. I hesitated, not wanting to burden her with this. But I knew I couldn't keep it from her either. "I got a call today. From Emily." "Emily? Julia's friend?" Rachel's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "Why would she be calling you?" "It's about Julia," I explained, sitting down on the couch. "Apparently, she's in trouble. She's been drinking and getting involved with dangerous people. Emily thinks she's in real danger, and she asked me to talk to her." Rachel sat down next to me, her hand on my arm. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd talk to her," I admitted, feeling the weight of the decision. "I don't want to, Rachel, but I feel like I have to. I can't just ignore this." Rachel was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I understand why you feel that way, Michael. And I support you, whatever you decide. But just be careful, okay? You've come so far, and I don't want you to get hurt again." I nodded, grateful for her understanding. "I'll be careful, I promise." Later that evening, I found myself standing outside Julia's apartment building, the place Emily had described. It was a far cry from the home we had once shared, run down, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that cast an eerie glow over the entrance. I took a deep breath and walked inside, the scent of stale cigarettes and dampness hitting me as I climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor. I reached her door, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment I had been dreading all day. I knocked, and after a few moments, I heard the shuffling of feet on the other side. The door creaked open, and there she was, Julia, standing in the dim light, looking more broken than I had ever seen her. Her once vibrant eyes were dull, her face pale and drawn. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe I was there. "Julia," I replied, my heart aching at the sight of her. "We need to talk." She stepped aside, letting me in, and as I walked into the small, cluttered apartment, I couldn't help but wonder if I was making a terrible mistake. But as much as I wanted to turn around and leave, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Julia closed the door behind me, and we stood there, facing each other in the dim light of the apartment, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressing down on us both. "What's going on, Julia?" I asked, my voice gentle but firm. "Emily told me you're in trouble." She looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she murmured. "I didn't want you to know. But I do know, and I'm here now," I said, stepping closer to her. "Let me help you, Julia. Whatever you've gotten yourself into, we can figure it out. But you need to be honest with me." For a long moment, Julia didn't say anything. Then, finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "I'm scared, Michael," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've made so many mistakes, and I don't know how to fix them. I don't know if I can." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out together. But you have to trust me. You have to let me help you." As we stood there, her hand in mine, I realized that this was the real test, the moment that would determine whether I had truly moved on or whether the past still had a hold on me. And as much as I wanted to walk away, to leave Julia to face the consequences of her actions, I knew that I couldn't. Not until I had done everything I could to help her, to save her from the darkness she had fallen into. Because even though I had moved on, even though I had found happiness with Rachel, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared about Julia. That part of me wouldn't let me turn my back on her, not when she needed me most. And so, I stayed. I stayed to help Julia, to do what I could to pull her out of the mess she had created. But as I looked into her eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the past wasn't done with me yet. And that there were still more challenges ahead. Challenges that would test everything I had built, and everything I had come to believe about myself and my future. And as I faced those challenges, I knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. Not anymore. As I left Julia's apartment that night, my mind was racing. The conversation we had wasn't easy. Julia had opened up to me, revealing the depths of the trouble she was in. The debts she owed weren't just financial. They were tied to dangerous people, people who wouldn't think twice about using violence to get what they wanted. I had tried to offer her solutions, even suggesting that she go to the police, but Julia was too far gone. She was convinced that if she involved the authorities, things would only get worse. The desperation in her eyes was haunting, and it struck me just how close she was to the edge. She was a shell of the woman I once knew, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. I had set this whole chain of events into motion, and now she was paying the price. But as much as I felt responsible, I also knew I couldn't let myself get dragged back into the darkness that had nearly consumed me before. I had to find a way to help her without losing myself in the process. The next morning, I called Emily. I told her everything Julia had shared with me, and we agreed that something needed to be done, quickly. Emily was scared, but she was also determined to help her friend. Together, we decided that we would try to reach out to some of Julia's family members, people who might be able to provide the financial support she needed to get out of this mess. But when we contacted Julia's parents, the conversation didn't go as we had hoped. They were angry, disappointed, and unwilling to bail her out again. They had done it too many times before, and they were tired of watching her make the same mistakes over and over. It was clear that they had reached their breaking point. I could understand their frustration. Julia had always been headstrong, prone to making impulsive decisions and expecting others to pick up the pieces. But this time, the consequences were much more severe, and I could see that her parents were genuinely afraid for her safety. Still, they refused to intervene, leaving Julia to fend for herself. After that, Emily and I were at a loss. We didn't know where to turn or what else we could do. But as I sat there, mulling over the situation, an idea began to form in my mind, an idea that was risky, but perhaps the only way to truly help Julia. I decided to reach out to James. It was a long shot, and I knew it. James was the man who had come between Julia and me, the man whose affair with her had shattered our marriage. But despite my feelings about him, I also knew that he was wealthy, connected, and possibly the only person who could offer Julia the help she needed without expecting anything in return. It wasn't an easy decision, and it took me several hours to work up the nerve to make the call. When I finally did, I wasn't sure what to expect. The phone rang a few times before James answered. "Hello? James, it's Michael." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear him trying to figure out why I was calling. "Michael, this is a surprise. What's going on?" "I'm calling about Julia," I said, getting straight to the point. "She's in trouble, and I think you might be the only person who can help her." Another pause, this one filled with tension. "What kind of trouble?" "The serious kind," I replied, my voice steady. I explained the situation to him as briefly as I could, laying out the facts without going into too much detail. I could hear him sigh heavily as I spoke, and I wasn't sure if it was out of concern for Julia or exasperation at being dragged into something he had likely tried to distance himself from. When I finished, there was a long silence. "So you're asking me to bail her out?" he said finally, his tone unreadable. "I'm asking you to help her," I corrected. "I know she made mistakes, and I'm not saying she doesn't deserve to face the consequences. But I also know that if someone doesn't step in, she could end up seriously hurt, or worse. I don't have the resources to help her the way you do, and I'm running out of options." James sighed again, and I could tell he was conflicted. "Why are you doing this, Michael? After everything that happened, why do you still care?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Because, as much as she hurt me, I don't want to see her destroyed. She's still a human being, and no one deserves what's happening to her. And maybe I just want to close this chapter of my life with a clear conscience." Another long silence followed, and I wondered if I had said too much. But then, finally, James spoke. "All right, I'll help her, but this is the last time. After this, she's on her own." Relief washed over me, though it was tempered with the realization that this was only a temporary solution. "Thank you, James. I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Just make sure she knows this is it. I'm not going to keep bailing her out." We ended the call, and I sat there for a while, trying to process everything. It felt strange to have turned to James for help, even stranger that he had agreed. But I knew it was the right thing to do, and for now, that was enough. Later that evening, I called Julia and told her what I had done. She was quiet at first, processing the news. "James, he's really going to help me?" she asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Yes, but this is it, Julia, I said firmly. You need to get your life together. This is your last chance, and if you mess it up, there won't be anyone left to save you. She didn't respond right away, but I could hear the emotion in her breathing. I know, Michael, I know I've screwed up so many times. But I'm going to try. I promise I'll try to do better. I hope you do, I replied. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point for Julia. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, the weight of the day's events pressing down on me. But alongside that weight, there was also a sense of closure. I had done everything I could to help Julia, and now the rest was up to her. As I lay in bed that night, Rachel by my side, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The past had resurfaced, but I had faced it head on. And now, as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever happened next, I was finally ready to move forward, for real this time. The days that followed were strangely calm, almost as if the storm had passed and left behind a fragile peace. Julia was out of immediate danger, thanks to James, and I had done my part. I should have felt relieved, content even, but something lingered in the back of my mind, an unease that I couldn't quite shake. Rachel noticed, of course. She always did. One evening, as we were having dinner, she reached across the table and took my hand. Michael, you've been quiet these past few days. What's on your mind? I looked up at her, the warmth in her eyes soothing the restlessness I felt. It's just everything with Julia. I know I did what I could, but I keep wondering if I made the right choice by getting involved again. Rachel squeezed my hand gently. You did what you felt was right. You helped someone who needed it, even when it wasn't easy. That's something to be proud of, Michael, not something to doubt. I know, I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. It's just that I can't help but feel like there's something unresolved, like there's one more thing I need to do before I can finally put all of this behind me. Rachel nodded thoughtfully, then gave me a small, encouraging smile. Maybe you're right, but whatever it is, I'm here for you. We'll face it together. Her words comforted me, and I realized that no matter what happened next, I wasn't alone. I had Rachel by my side, and that made all the difference. The following week, I received a text from Emily. She had been checking in on Julia and wanted to update me on her progress. According to Emily, Julia was trying to get her life back on track. She was going to meetings, staying sober, and making an effort to distance herself from the people who had dragged her down. But there was something in Emily's message that caught my attention. She mentioned that Julia had been asking about me, wondering why I had helped her after everything that had happened, and whether I could ever forgive her. It was then that I realized what had been bothering me. Despite everything I had done, there was still one conversation left to have, one final confrontation that I had been avoiding. I needed to speak with Julia, not just to check on her progress, but to address the unresolved emotions between us. There were things that needed to be said, truths that had been buried for too long. So, I decided to visit her one last time. The day was overcast when I arrived at her apartment building. The clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain, and the air was thick with humidity. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my thoughts, before finally making my way up to her door. When Julia opened it, she looked different. There was a lightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of hope that had been missing for a long time. Michael, she said, surprised but not unhappy to see me. I didn't expect you to come by. I wanted to check on you, I replied, stepping inside. The apartment was tidier than before, and the air felt less oppressive, as if the space itself had been given a second chance. Emily told me you've been doing better. Julia nodded, gesturing for me to sit down. I'm trying. It's not easy, but I'm trying. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, Julia broke the silence. Why did you do it, Michael? Why did you help me after everything? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Because, despite everything that happened, I didn't want to see you destroy yourself. You hurt me, Julia, more than I ever thought possible, but I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. I wanted to know that we could both move on from this, that we could find some kind of peace. Julia looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the surface of the coffee table. I've spent so much time hating myself for what I did to you, for what I did to us. And for a long time, I thought that if I just punished myself enough, it would somehow make things right. But it didn't. It just made everything worse. I nodded, understanding what she meant. Self-destruction doesn't bring redemption, Julia. It just deepens the wounds. I know that now. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. I don't expect you to forgive me, Michael. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry for everything. And I'm sorry that it took me so long to see the damage I caused. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, especially after what I had been through. But as I looked at Julia, sitting across from me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years, I realized that I didn't want to carry the weight of resentment any longer. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you completely, I said honestly. But I'm willing to try. And maybe that's a start. Julia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Thank you, Michael. That means more to me than you know. We sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were just two people, no longer husband and wife, no longer enemies, but simply two people trying to find their way forward. As I left her apartment that day, I felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. The past had been confronted, and while it wasn't completely behind me, it no longer had the power to control my future. When I returned home, Rachel was waiting for me. She smiled as I walked through the door, and I knew that she could see the difference in me. It went well? She asked, her voice filled with hope. It did, I replied, pulling her into an embrace. I think it's finally over. Rachel held me close, and as we stood there together, I knew that I was ready to move on. The shadows of the past had finally been laid to rest, and now, there was nothing left but the future, our future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The night of the anniversary dinner arrived quicker than I expected. It had been months since I'd made the decision to expose Julia and James, and as the day approached, the weight of what I was about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. But there was no turning back now. The pieces were in place, and tonight, the truth would come out. Rachel was by my side as we prepared for the evening. She looked stunning in a deep blue dress that hugged her figure. Her hair elegantly styled. Her presence was a comfort, a reminder of the new life I was building. I knew that after tonight, there would be no more ghosts from the past haunting us. As we arrived at the restaurant, I was greeted by the sight of our closest friends and family, gathered around the long, elegantly set table. The atmosphere was warm and cheerful, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Julia was already there, looking beautiful in a crimson dress, with James sitting beside her. They were the picture of a happy couple, but I knew better. I could see that Julia was nervous, though she hid it well. She had no idea what was about to happen, and that gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. I had spent so long planning this evening, making sure every detail was perfect. The private investigator I hired had delivered everything I needed: photos, videos, and even recorded conversations that left no doubt about the affair. The dinner began with light conversation, the kind that skirts around anything too serious. I kept up appearances, laughing and joking with everyone as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But underneath, I was counting down the minutes, waiting for the right moment. As the main course was served, I felt the tension in the air shift. It was almost time. I caught Rachel's eye across the table, and she gave me a small nod, her expression supportive. She knew how much this meant to me, how important it was that Julia's betrayal was finally brought to light. When the desserts were brought out, I stood up, raising my glass to make a toast. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to me. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, I began, my voice steady. It means a lot to celebrate this occasion with the people who matter most to us. But before we continue, there's something I need to share. I saw Julia's smile falter slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. James, too, looked uneasy, though he tried to hide it. I set my glass down and picked up the remote that had been hidden discreetly beside my plate. "I've put together a little something to commemorate this evening," I said, pressing the button. The screen behind me flickered to life, and the room darkened as a video began to play. At first, it showed photos of Julia and me, happy moments from our past, our wedding day, vacations, holidays. But then, the images began to change. Pictures of Julia and James together, stolen moments that she thought no one had seen. And then the videos, grainy, zoomed-in footage of the two of them in intimate situations. Unaware that they were being recorded. Gasps filled the room as the realization of what they were seeing dawned on the guests. Julia's face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock and horror. James looked like he had been punched in the gut, his expression one of utter disbelief. I didn't want to believe it at first, I said, my voice calm and measured. But the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Julia, James, I think it's time everyone knew the truth. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Julia looked around at the faces of our friends and family, her gaze pleading, but no one came to her defense. They were too stunned, too betrayed by the facade she had maintained for so long. Tears welled up in Julia's eyes, and she turned to James, but he couldn't meet her gaze. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. I didn't want it to come to this, I continued, my voice softening. But you left me no choice, Julia. You lied to me, to all of us. And you continued to lie even when you knew the truth would eventually come out. The silence was broken by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. It was Julia's father, standing up with a look of deep disappointment etched into his face. How could you do this, Julia? He asked, his voice filled with pain. Julia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was too overwhelmed, too consumed by the realization of what she had lost. One by one, the guests began to stand, some leaving the room entirely, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. Rachel came to stand beside me, slipping her hand into mine as the room continued to empty. Julia was left alone, tears streaming down her face, while James stood silently by, knowing that any attempt to defend himself would be futile. Finally, I turned to Julia, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. I loved you, Julia. I trusted you, but you betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Now, it's over. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, Rachel by my side. As we stepped into the cool night air, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. The chapter was finally closed, the truth was out, and I could finally move forward. We drove home in silence, the enormity of what had just happened settling in. But as we pulled into the driveway, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The past was behind me now, and for the first time in a long time, I could see a future that was free from the shadows of betrayal. Inside the house, Rachel turned to me, her eyes searching mine. Are you okay? She asked softly. I nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. I am now, I said, and I meant it. The final confrontation had been painful, but it was necessary. Now, I could truly start over, with Rachel by my side, and nothing left to haunt me. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk, free from the chains of the past. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The day after the dinner felt like waking up after a storm. The air was still, and everything was quiet as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in my mind. Beside me, Rachel was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady. She had been my rock through all of this, the one person who had stood by me without hesitation. And now, as the dust began to settle, I realized just how much I owed her for that. I carefully slipped out of bed, not wanting to wake her, and made my way to the kitchen. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that comes after something big has happened, leaving everyone unsure of what to say or do next. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up, expecting more fallout from the dinner, but instead, it was a message from Julia. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready to hear what she had to say. Michael, I don't know where to begin. Last night was devastating. I know I deserve every bit of it, but I still can't believe it happened. I wanted to hate you for it, but I can't. I know I brought this on myself, and I have no one to blame but me. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day we can both find some kind of peace. Take care. I stared at the screen for a long time, her words sinking in. Part of me had expected anger, maybe even defiance. But instead, there was a sadness, a finality to her message that made it clear she understood what she had lost. But it didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. I had done what I set out to do, exposed her lies, her betrayal, and yet, in the aftermath, all I felt was a deep, hollow emptiness. I knew that this wasn't just the end of my marriage with Julia, it was the end of something far bigger, the end of the life I had built, the future I had once imagined. And now, with everything laid bare, I was left standing in the ruins, trying to figure out what came next. Rachel joined me in the kitchen not long after, wrapping her arms around my waist as I stared out the window, lost in thought. "You've been up for a while," she said softly, resting her head against my back. "Yeah," I replied, my voice distant. "Just thinking." She didn't press me, just held me close, letting me know she was there. After a moment, she asked, "Did you hear from her?" I nodded. "She sent me a message. She's sorry, but she knows there's no going back." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You did what you had to do, Michael. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Now it's time to move forward." "I know," I said, though the words felt heavy on my tongue. "But it's hard to know where to start." She turned me around to face her, her eyes filled with understanding. "You start by letting go. You've carried this pain for a long time, but now it's over. You have a chance to build something new. Something better. And you don't have to do it alone." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. I leaned down and kissed her, grateful for her strength and her support. "Thank you, Rachel, for everything. We're in this together," she said, smiling up at me. No more looking back. As the days turned into weeks, I began to settle into a new routine. The initial shock of what had happened began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in years. I threw myself into work, into my relationship with Rachel, and slowly but surely, the pieces of my life started to come together again. But the echoes of the past still lingered. There were moments when I would think of Julia, of the life we had once shared, and a wave of sadness would wash over me. It wasn't that I missed her, exactly, it was more that I mourned the loss of what could have been, the life that had never come to fruition. One afternoon, as I was going through some old boxes in the garage, I came across our wedding album. I hadn't seen it in years, and for a moment, I considered throwing it out, but something made me pause. I opened the album, flipping through the pages, each photo a snapshot of a different time, a different version of myself. There we were, smiling, carefree, full of hope for the future. I looked at the man in those photos, and I hardly recognized him. He was naive, unaware of the trials that lay ahead, but he was also happy, unburdened by the weight of betrayal. I closed the album and set it aside, not quite ready to let it go. It was a part of my past, and while it no longer defined me, it had shaped who I had become. And maybe that was okay. As I packed up the rest of the boxes, I found myself thinking about the future. Rachel and I had talked about taking a trip together, something to mark the beginning of this new chapter in our lives. I realized that I was looking forward to it, not just because it would be a break from everything, but because it was a chance to start over, to create new memories, untainted by the past. That night, we made a fire in the fireplace and cooked dinner together, the cabin filled with the smell of roasting vegetables and sizzling meat. It was simple, but it felt special, like the beginning of something important. We ate by the fire, talking and laughing, the warmth of the flames wrapping around us like a blanket. After dinner, we curled up on the couch, the fire crackling softly in the background. Rachel rested her head on my chest, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling a sense of contentment that I hadn't known in a long time. As I lay there, I found myself thinking back to everything that had led me to this moment, the betrayal, the pain, the confrontation. It had been a dark time, one that had tested me in ways I never expected. But now, as I held Rachel close, I realized that it had also led me to something better, something worth fighting for. Julia was a part of my past, and that past would always be with me, but it no longer had the power to control me. I had made it through the storm, and now, on the other side, I could see the sun beginning to rise. Rachel stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft and sleepy. "Just how lucky I am," I replied, kissing the top of her head. "How lucky we are." She smiled, her eyes closing again as she snuggled closer. "We deserve this, Michael. We deserve to be happy." And as I held her, listening to the crackling of the fire and the quiet of the night outside, I knew she was right. The road ahead might still have its challenges. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face them. The past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was free to write a new story, one filled with love, hope, and possibility. And with Rachel by my side, I knew that anything was possible. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the weight of the past finally lifted, leaving behind only the lightness of a new beginning. The future was ours to create, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms.